Chapter number 8 of The Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter number 8, 1769, Society Islands. Prodigious expert thieves. Hardly had the anchor reached the bottom before they were surrounded by canoes, whose occupants were anxious to sell the supplies of fruits, raw and cooked fish, and a pig they had brought. The price asked for the pig was a hatchet, and as these were scarce, it was not purchased. When all was made safe, a party went ashore and was well received by the natives, but those who had previously been there with Wallis reported that those who were at that time said to be chiefs were keeping in the background. The next day, however, 2 men, evidently of rank, came on board, and being invited into the cabin, went through a ceremony described by Banks. Each singled out his friend. One took the captain, and the other chose myself. Each took off a part of his clothes and dressed his friend with what he took off. In return for this, we presented them with a hatchet and some beads. They were then invited by their new friends to go ashore. On landing, they were escorted to a building and introduced to an old man they had not seen before, and he presented Cook with a cock, and Banks with a hen, and each with a piece of native cloth. Banks gave in return for his share his large laced silk neckcloth and a linen handkerchief. After this they were permitted to stroll about, and received many tokens of amity in the shape of green boughs, and were then entertained at a banquet, the principal dishes being fish and breadfruit. Whilst at dinner, Solander had his pocket picked of an opera glass, and Monkhouse lost his snuff-box. As soon as this was made known, Lycurgus, as they had named one of their friends, drove off the people, striking them and throwing anything he could lay his hands to at them. He offered pieces of cloth as compensation, and when these were refused, extended his offer to everything he possessed. He was at last made to understand that all that was wanted was the return of the stolen articles, and after a time the snuff-box and the case of the glass were returned, and by and by the glass itself. During the whole of the stay at the island they had the greatest difficulties with the natives for stealing, an accomplishment at which, Cook says, they were prodigious expert. On the whole, their first visit ashore was satisfactory, and was thought to augur well for the observations of the transit. A site was selected for a camp on the eastern point of the bay, to which the name of Point Venus was given. The longitude, according to Cook, was 149 degrees 31 minutes west, and to Wharton 149 degrees 29 minutes west. Lines were traced for the boundaries, and Banks' largest tent was pitched and a guard mounted, and then the others went for a walk of inspection. They passed through some woods that Mr. Hicks had been prevented from exploring the day before, and Banks had the luck to bring down 3 ducks with 1 shot, a deed thought likely to impress the natives with respect for the white man's weapon. On their road back to camp they were alarmed by a musket shot, and hurrying on found that one of the sentries had been pushed down and his musket stolen, so the midshipman in command had ordered a shot to be fired at the thief, who was killed, but the musket was not recovered. All the natives ran away but one, whom Cook calls F.R.S, and whom the master, Mr. Molyneux, who had been out with Wallis, recognised as being a man of some authority. Through F.R. an attempt was made to arrange matters, but the natives were very shy when the English landed the next day. However, the two chiefs who had first made friends, to whom the names of Lycurgus and Hercules had been given, again came on board, bringing the presents of pigs and breadfruit. They concluded, as Hercules' present was the larger, he was the richer, and therefore the more important chief. To lessen the chances of disagreements in trading, and to keep some control of prices, Cook ordered that only one person should conduct the purchasing for the ship, and as Banks had shown aptitude in dealing with the natives, he was appointed. The natives were to be treated with every imaginable humanity. On the 16th, Mr. Buchan, the artist, had another epileptic fit, which was unfortunately fatal, and he was buried at sea to run no risk of offending against any of the customs or superstitions of the natives. Cook, in referring to his death, says, "He will be greatly missed in the course of this voyage." In the afternoon the ship was brought into such a position as to command the site of the proposed camp, and as there was to be an eclipse of one of Jupiter's satellites, Cook and Green stayed ashore to get an observation, but the weather was unpropitious. Cook sketches. The camp was now got into order. The north and south sides were protected by a bank 4 feet 6 inches high on the inside, having a ditch 10 feet wide and 6 feet deep on the outside. The west side, facing the bay, had a 4-foot bank crowned by a palisade, with no ditch, and the east side, on the bank of the river, was protected by a double row of water casks. The armament consisted of 2 carriage guns on the weakest or east side, and 6 swivel guns, 2 on each of the other sides. The garrison was 45 men, including civilians, and Cook considered it was practically impregnable. In the manuscripts department of the British Museum is a pen and ink sketch and a plan of the fort, drawn by Cook, which agrees much better with the description than the engraving of Parkinson's drawing, published in the History of the Voyage. The natives were disturbed by these preparations, some leaving the bay, but when no dreadful results occurred, they took courage and returned. The fort completed, the instruments were landed and put into the required positions to be prepared for their work, and the following morning the quadrant, which had not been removed from the case in which it was packed in London, was found to be missing, although a sentry had been stationed within 5 yards of it the whole night. Inquiries were made, and it was elicited that the thief had been seen making off with it. Banks, his native friend, and 1 or 2 of the English at once started, closely followed by Cook and a party of marines. After a long chase, the quadrant was recovered, but some of the smaller parts were missing. After a time these also were returned in the case of a horse pistol, which had been stolen from Banks, and soon after the pistol was recovered and they were able to return to camp. On their arrival they found Cook's friend Dutaha Hercules had been detained as a hostage, so he at once was released, to the great delight of the natives, who had been much alarmed to see the armed party go into the woods. In order to show his gratitude for his release, Dutaha sent a present of 2 hogs to Cook, for which he refused to take any return. But afterwards second thoughts proved best, and he sent a man to ask for an axe and a shirt, and to say that he was going away and would not be back for 10 days. As the supplies of vegetables and fruit in the market had been decreasing in quantity, it was thought better to refuse the present in hopes he would apply for it in person, and arrangements could then be made for a regular market. but he sent someone else again, and so word was returned that Cook and Banks would bring it to him the following day. For fear this promise should be forgotten, Dootahah again sent his man, and Cook and Banks started off in the pinnace. On their arrival they were received by a large crowd, which was kept in order by a man in an immense turban, armed with a long white stick, which he applied to the people with great judgment and relish. The party were conducted to a large tree, and very graciously received by Dootahah, who immediately asked for his axe, which was given him, together with a shirt and a piece of broadcloth made into a boat cloak. He put on the cloak and gave the shirt to the man with the stick, and refreshments were served. They were afterwards entertained with dancing and wrestling, and then Dootahah accompanied them back to the ship, taking his supplies for dinner, and when it became known he was on board, trading was resumed. A day or two after, Banks received an urgent message from his friend Taburai, Lycurgus, saying he was very ill. He complained of having been poisoned by one of the sailors. It seems he had noticed a sailor's chewing and asked for a quid, had bitten off a piece and swallowed it. Banks prescribed large draughts of coconut milk, with happy results. Surf riding. Flies were a terrible pest. They got into everything and ate off the artist's colours almost as fast as they could be laid on. Tar and molasses were dried as a trap for them, but the natives stole it and used it as an ointment for sores. The surf riding struck the visitors with admiration. Swimming out with a piece of board, they would mount it, and come in on the crest of the waves, and Banks says he does not believe that any European could have lived amongst the breakers as they did. He especially admired the manner they timed the waves and dived beneath on their way out from shore. A blacksmith's forge had been set up, and in spare time the smith would fashion old iron into axes, or repair old axes for the natives, and it was noticed that some of these old axes were not of English make, and it appeared unlikely they were obtained from the Dolphin. At length it was ascertained that since Wallis's visit in that vessel, 2 ships had anchored off the east coast, and it was concluded from the description given by the natives of the flags that they were Spanish. But on the arrival of the Endeavour at Batavia, they were able to identify them as French ships commanded by Monsieur de Bougainville, whose crews were suffering very severely from scurvy at the time. Paying a visit to Dootahah to see if a supply of fresh meat, which was running very short, could be obtained, they were received in a very friendly manner, but being delayed till it was too late to return to the ship by daylight, they remained all night, and as a consequence nearly everyone found they had lost some property. Cook's stockings were stolen from under his pillow, where he had placed them for safety. Perhaps as consolation for their losses they were entertained during the night to a concert, 3 drums and 4 flutes, the latter having 4 holes, into one of which the performer blew with his nostrils, were the orchestra, and Cook's criticism is hardly complimentary. The music and singing were so much of a piece that I was very glad when it was over. They waited till noon the next day in hopes of meat and the return of the stolen articles, but in vain, though Dootahah promised he would bring all to the ship, a promise we had no reason to expect he would fulfil. The transit of Venus. The important day of the observation was now approaching, and everything was in readiness. In order to diminish the risk of disappointment through local atmospheric disturbance, Cook sent a party to Eimeo, York Island, and sent one to the southeast of Otaheite, as far to the east of Point Venus as possible. The first party consisted of Lieutenant Gore, Banks, Sporing and Monkhouse, and the second of Lieutenant Hicks, Clerk, Pickersgill and Saunders, Mr. Green providing the necessary instruments. At Fort Venus everything was in good working order. The astronomical clock was set up in the large tent, being placed in a strong frame made for the purpose at Greenwich, and was then planted in the ground as firmly as possible and fenced around to prevent accidental disturbance. 12 feet away the observatory was placed, comprising the telescopes on their stands, the quadrant securely fixed on the top of a cask of wet sand firmly set in the ground, and the journeyman clock. The telescopes used by Cook and Green were 2 reflecting ones made by Mr. J. Short. The 3rd of June proved as favourable to our purposes as we could wish. Not a cloud to be seen the whole day, and the air was perfectly clear, so that we had every advantage we could desire in observing the whole passage of the planet of Venus over the sun's disk. We very distinctly saw the atmosphere, or dusty shade, around the body of the planet, which very much disturbed the time of contact, particularly the 2 internal ones. Dr. Solander observed as well as Mr. Green and myself, and we differed from one another in observing the times of contact much more than could be expected. Mr. Green's telescope and mine were of the same magnifying power, but that of the doctor was greater than ours. It was nearly calm the whole day, and the thermometer exposed to the sun about the middle of the day rose to a degree of heat we had not before met with. In the report published in the Philosophical Transactions he also refers to the heat. Every wished-for favourable circumstance attended the whole of the day, without one single impediment excepting the heat, which was intolerable. The thermometer, which hung by the clock, and was exposed to the sun as we were, was one time as high as 119 degrees. This report is accompanied by diagrams illustrating the different contacts and the effects of the penumbra, which Cook believes to be better seen by Solander than by himself or Green. It was estimated at about 7/8 of a diameter of the planet, and was visible to Cook throughout the whole transit. The times taken by Green were: the first external contact 9 hours 25 minutes 42 seconds AM. The first internal contact 9 hours 44 minutes 4 seconds AM. The second internal contact 3 hours 14 minutes 8 seconds PM. The second external contact 3 hours 22 minutes 10 seconds PM. The other 2 parties were equally successful, and at times Banks was able to employ himself in trading with the natives, with whom he soon got on friendly terms. In fact, he had to decline further purchases, as he had as much as they could take away with them. He was also successful in his botanical inquiries, obtaining several plants he had not seen in Otaheite. Whilst the observations were being taken, some of the crew broke into the store and stole a quantity of the large nails that were used as a medium of trade with the islanders. One man was found with 7 in his possession, and after careful inquiry was sentenced to 24 lashes, which seems to have been the severest sentence meted out by Cook during the voyage. The sentence was carried out, and though it was well known that more than one was implicated, he refused to name anyone else, but suffered in silence. A dog dinner. The King's birthday being on the 5th of June, Cook entertained several of the chiefs at dinner, and the health of Kilnargo was toasted so many times by some of them that the result was disastrous. One of the presents received from a chief was a dog, which they were informed was good to eat. After some discussion it was handed to a native named Tupia, who had made himself very useful, and afterwards accompanied them on the voyage, and he, having smothered it with his hands and drawn it, wrapped it in leaves and baked it in a native oven. With some hesitation it was tasted and met with general approval. Cook says, "Therefore we resolved for the future never to despise dog flesh," and in another place he says they put dog's flesh next only to English lamb. These dogs were bred for eating and lived entirely on vegetable food. The main object of their stay at Otaheite having been attained, steps were taken for further prosecution of the voyage. The ship was careened, her bottom scraped, and found free from worm, but the boats had suffered, particularly the long boat, which had had to have a new bottom. She had been varnished only. The other boats, painted with white lead, had not suffered so much. The stores were overhauled, and the ship was fitted for sea. Whilst these preparations were being made, Cook and Banks made a circuit of the island in the pinnace to examine the coast. Several good anchorages were found, with from 16 to 24 fathoms, and good holding ground. The southeast portion was almost cut off from the mainland by a narrow, marshy isthmus, about 2 miles wide, over which the natives dragged their canoes with little difficulty. On the south coast, one of the large burying places was seen, by far the most extensive one on the island. It is described as a long square of stonework built pyramidically. Its base is 267 feet by 87 feet. At the top it is 250 feet by 8 feet. It is built in the same manner as we do steps leading up to a sundial, or fountain erected in the middle of a square, where there is a flight of steps on each side. In this building there are 11 of such steps. Each step is about 4 feet in height, and the breadth 4 feet 7 inches, but they decreased both in height and breadth from the bottom to the top. On the middle of the top stood the image of a bird carved in wood. Near it lay the broken one of a fish, carved in stone. There was no hollow or cavity in the inside, the whole being filled up with stones. The outside was faced partly with hewn stones, and partly with others, and these were placed in such a manner as to look very agreeable to the eye. Some of the hewn stones were 4 feet 7 inches by 2 feet 4 inches, and 15 inches thick, and having been squared and polished with some sort of an edge tool. On the east side was enclosed with a stone wall a piece of ground in the form of a square, 360 feet by 354. In this was growing several cypress trees and plantains. Round about this Mori were several smaller ones, all going to decay, and on the beach, between them and the sea, lay scattered up and down a great quantity of human bones. Not far from the great Mori was 2 or 3 pretty large altars, where lay the skull bones of some hogs and dogs. This monument stands on the south side of Oparianu, upon a low point of land about 100 yards from the sea. It appeared to have been built many years, and was in a state of decay, as most of their Moris are. They were quite unable to gain information as to the history of these remains, nor of the religious beliefs of the islander. though they appeared to have some vague notions of a future life. An excursion inland. When the party returned to Point Venus, they found the refitting nearly complete, but the anchor stocks all had to be renewed owing to the ravages of the sea worms, so Banks and Monkhouse made an excursion up the river on which the camp was situated. In about 9 miles the precipitous banks had completely closed them in, and further advance was blocked by a cliff at least 100 feet high, over which the river fell. The natives with them said that they had never been further, so the expedition returned. Charles Darwin in 1835 made an attempt to ascend the same river, and though he penetrated some distance further, he describes the country as extremely difficult. He saw several places where 2 or 3 determined men could easily hold at bay many times their own number. Gardens had been laid out during their stay, and European seeds were planted, which were fairly successful, except some brought out by Cook in carefully sealed bottles, none of which turned out well. Some of the sailors were either enticed away or attempted to desert, so Cook seized 1 or 2 of the chiefs as hostages, and runaways were quickly returned. Some of the natives were anxious to go away with them, and Banks persuaded Cook to let them take Tupia, a man supposed to be of priestly rank, who had proved himself very useful on several occasions, and he was allowed to take with him a boy as a servant. Cook records, on the leaving, that during the 3 months' stay they had been on very good terms with the natives, and the few misunderstandings that did occur rose either from the difficulty of explaining matters to each other, or else from the inveterate habits of theft on the part of the natives, iron in any shape being simply irresistible. On the 13th of July the Endeavour sailed for Huahine, anchoring inside the reef on the north-west on the 17th. Banks, Solander, Monkhouse and Tupia at once accompanied Cook ashore, where a ceremony, presumed to be a sort of treaty of peace, was gone through, and then they were permitted to go where they liked. On this ceremonial, Cook says, "It further appeared that the things which Tupia gave away was for the God of this people, as they gave us a hog and some coconuts for our God, and thus they have certainly drawn us in to commit sacrilege, for the hog hath already received sentence of death, and is to be dissected tomorrow." A careful pilot. A market was organised by Monkhouse, and as soon as the natives understood that the stay of the ship would be very short, they managed to produce a fairly good supply of fruits and vegetables. The people were found to be rather lighter complexioned, and certainly not so addicted to thieving as the Otaheitans. As a memorial of the visit, Cook gave the chief a plate with the inscription, "His Britannic Majesty's Ship Endeavour, Lieutenant Cook, Commander, 16th of July 1769, Huahine." He also added some medals or counters of the English coins, struck in 1761, and other presents, and the recipient promised he would never part with them. From this place they went to Ulitia, Raiatea, landing on the 21st, and after another ceremonial the English Jack was hoisted, and possession taken of the whole group in the name of King George. Tupia proved himself an excellent pilot, with great knowledge of the localities, and having sent down a diver at Huahine to ascertain the exact draught of the ship, he was very careful she never went into less than 5 fathoms of water. He had evidently had great experience in navigating these seas in canoes, boats of whose construction and sailing qualities Cook speaks in the highest terms. Banks at this time remarks, "We have now seen 17 islands in these seas, and have landed on 5 of the most important. The language, manners, and customs agreed most exactly." Detained by adverse wind off Otaha, and finding the water coming badly into the foresail room and powder room, Cook put into the west side to repair and take in ballast, as the ship was getting too light to carry sail on a wind. He took the opportunity to survey to the north with Banks and Solander. Putting into one place, they were well received and entertained with music and dancing, and Cook's verdict was that neither their music or dancing were at all calculated to please a European. A sort of farce was also acted, but they could make nothing of it except that it showed that these people have a notion of dramatic performances. During the whole stay in the Society group, they had been very well off for fresh food, consequently their sea stores had been little called on. Jarvis, in his history of the Hawaiian or Sandwich Islands, says that with Cook a silence in regards to the maritime efforts of his predecessors is observable throughout his journals, and as a proof that he traded on the knowledge of others, he remarks that at Otaheite he made inquiries if there were any islands to the north, and afterwards evinced no surprise when he discovered them. Now Cook in his journals constantly shows that he compares his knowledge with that of others, and often regrets he has not further records to consult. As for his inquiries, he would have been grossly neglecting his duty had he not made them, for it was only a common sense method of procedure, which evidently Mr. Jarvis could not understand. The result of these inquiries can be seen in the British Museum in the shape of a map drawn by Cook from information given by Tupia. On it are some sentences in the Otahitian language. End of chapter 8.